I'm Ivana Graham. This is part 2 of my interview with Tony Fishel and Alta Graham. In part 1, they shared that both of them had had intensive phonics training as children, but it did not teach them to read. Both of them eventually taught themselves to read using audiobooks. And they both encourage teachers everywhere to provide audiobooks and other audio content for their students so that dyslexic students who don't read yet can keep up with the material in the class. Now, on to part 2.
Now, you and Tony are both instructors now. Tony's a high school physics instructor, and you've worked as a music professor. So you've both been in a classroom situation, and I'd like to hear from each of you. Alta first, how your experience of learning to read could be translated into a classroom.
Well, first I'd say, the policy I went with is never test on anything you haven't said out loud, i.e., never test on something that they only got in a reading assignment.
Mm.
2, if you are making reading assignments, making them optional is great. Making a recording available is great.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're thinking about the actual learning to read part, making tracking activities available would be great. That's a bit harder to do in a classroom, but if there is independent study time, you can do it with a computer program.
Tony, since you teach high school students, this is especially interesting. What do you do in your classroom that accommodates different types of readers and non-readers?
I don't really do any teaching outside of the classroom. Like, I teach them everything they need to know in class. All of the notes and the problems are mathematical, so there's very little spelling. And any spelling there is, I'm making spelling mistakes on the board too, so it doesn't really matter. I haven't picked up a book to like teach from the book kind of once this year, and only go, when I think I'm pretty sure I'm done with the chapter. Let's see, and we do the problems at the end. And it's like, did we cover it all? Awesome. Let's do the test. And for some kids, it's gonna be hard, because if you're not gonna pay attention in class and they need to learn from the book, like, I guess they can go home and read it, which I think then frees the kids up, because I'm really focused on, this is the lesson today. I'm going to give you the information. You don't have to interpret anything about what's in the book through any kind of reading. If there's reading, I'll read the problem and then write the problem on the board. Kind of focus on the understanding of the physics rather than, do you understand what the problem means?
Mm-hmm.
There is a small part of, do you understand what the problem means? But it's more about understanding what the different things are in a physics problem that you need to use to calculate an answer, rather than the meaning of the words. If somebody had asked me, like, what's the difference between horizontal and vertical, I would tell them,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes it easier for me, because I don't have to, worry about like trying to explain something that the book explained in one way that I probably wouldn't have done it, and then try to be like, well, this is the way they should look at it. And for people that prefer the over and over and over, I need to read it several times to understand. Like, I can do that too. I can be like, all right, this is where you need to read it. But like, I think that most people learn better from just sitting down and being like, all right, is the lesson today connected to what was yesterday? Are we using a little bit of yesterday and today? Labs and all that stuff is a different story. There, I'm like, all right, if you want to videotape a lab because you really don't want to write it down, I'm cool with that. Like that's an option. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff that modern technology allows you to do. I would say that the whole approach to labs, writing down, using the proper language, the way to kind of express everything that you need to do in the lab report, which is kind of dictated not by me, but by kind of like the standards of science. So that's one thing where I do it everybody else's way. But when it comes to just teaching, I don't know if it's my way, but I'm like, I don't need the book. You don't need to worry about what the words mean. I'm going to speak to you, and if you don't understand what I say, stop, and I'll explain it to you. I mean, I've been doing it for so long. After 20 plus years, you think that like you start to figure certain things out.
Since both of you co-authored a book about learning to read, I'm interested in your motivation for doing that because that takes a lot of energy to remember all that stuff and write it down. So let's have Alta speak to that. What made you agree to co-author this book with me? And we'll show that book again so that we know which one we're talking about, Dyslexia Toolkit. Was it just because I twisted your arm, or did you have any other motivation?
Yes, I did have other motivation. Mostly for other kids finding themselves in similar positions, perhaps without parents with the luxury of pulling them out of school and spending all their time figuring them out. It was both a message for the parents slash tutors slash teachers that there's other ways to look at this, there's other things to try, and especially for the students, basically the message being you are not doomed.
Because a lot of kids in a standard school classroom feel pretty doomed, and I think Tony felt that. At least that comes across in his book, How Tony Learned to Read. Really moving story in which both Tony and his mother, Judy Fishel, share what it was like to have a very bright child who couldn't read. So, Tony, if you could address that same question, what motivated you to do the hard work of co-authoring the book?
I think my mom really inspired me to wanted to do something with her. Certainly hadn't kind of thought ahead in terms of like this is going to help people. I probably would have thought to be presumptuous or something. I always wanted to write, and I thought that there's just a subject matter that I happen to know a lot about. And then the more I dug into it and really thought about the questions that I thought I really knew the answers to, the more I really kind of lost myself in terms of just trying to piece it all together and remember it all, and even if it was just my mom, like that would be enough. But also kind of understanding that it might be like for a few other people.
Well, Tony, I think it's for more than a few other people. Since in my work as a tutor, I often hear from people who are young adults. So they're in their 20s or they're in their 30s and they're still not reading, just like you were. And being able to introduce them to your story is extremely motivating because it lets them know that it doesn't matter if you're past high school and you still don't read, there's still hope. That is maybe one of the most important pieces of your book. So I really appreciate having that book. I was very excited when I found it because it expresses your experiences so clearly and then also offers hope. So